Good afternoon. My name is Whitney Aaron Basil, and on behalf of the entire Theorizing the Web Organizing Committee, I'd like to welcome you to today's episode of Theorizing the Web Presents, Watching Me, Watching You. Theorizing the Web Presents is our new series of talks about technology and society. New episodes will stream live every other Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll also announce some special events later this fall. If you'd like to discuss today's episode in real time or submit questions for Q&A, please join us in the TTW Discord. You can find the Discord back channel by following the link in the description of this YouTube video or on our website, theorizingtheweb.org. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the production team at Museum of the Moving Image, without whom Theorizing the Web Presents truly would not be possible. I'd also like to thank my fellow organizing committee members and all three of today's panelists. And on behalf of all of us, we would like to thank you for watching and participating. If you like today's talk and you want to see more, please consider making a donation to Theorizing the Web and to the Museum of the Moving Image. Every donation helps us to produce content like this, and we're grateful that we can do this with you. With that, I will turn it over to today's moderator, Zachary Kaiser. Zachary is Assistant Professor of Graphic Design and Experience Architecture at Michigan State University. His current body of research questions the ideologies embedded in the design of technological products and services with which we interact and the impact of these ideologies on human intersubjectivity. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Whitney. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel, which is titled Watching Me, Watching You. Stuart Hall once wrote that he was interested in the politics of who we think we are. In both these presentations today, we will learn about wildly different ways that our understandings of ourselves and each other are structured and shaped. Key to this conversation is the way our technologies, ranging from Nextdoor to Palantir's predictive analytics systems, serve not merely as inputs for some kind of objective data, but rather through their deep interconnection to systems and structures of power, shape the parameters of who we can think we are in the first place. We come to mold our own behaviors and become legible and legitimate on the terms dictated by these technologies of authoritarianism and prejudice. Our presenters today are Keli Gabinelli and Sun-Ha Hong. Keli is a community organizer and media strategist living in Santa Cruz, California. Her work focuses on the intersections of housing, the home, social media, and technology. Her current projects include establishing the first community land trust in Santa Cruz, the Coastal Commons Land Trust, keeping her houseplants alive and propagating philodendrons. And Sun-Ha Hong examines speculations and fantasies surrounding big data and smart machines. He is the author of Technologies of Speculation, The Limits of Knowledge in a Data-Driven Society, which has just been released with NYU Press. It's very exciting. Sun-Ha is Assistant Professor of Communication at Simon Fraser University. So join me in welcoming Keli and Sun-Ha, and first we'll turn it over to Keli.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Zach, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Today, I'm going to show content collected as a user on Nextdoor in my community of Santa Cruz, California. I would also like to just preface by saying that there's a lot of words in this presentation, so please don't get overwhelmed trying to read all of them. Santa Cruz, California is one of the top 5 least affordable cities in the nation. It has the highest rate of homelessness in the nation. The average cost of a home in Santa Cruz is about $1 million. The median rent is about $3,000 or more. The city is comprised of about 60% of renters, and the No Place Like Home project, which was like an interdisciplinary community assessment of housing, basically found that of those renters, about 70% are rent burdened, which means that they're spending at least, over 30% of their income on rent. So there's many reasons for the housing and affordability crisis in Santa Cruz, changing demands of renters, inadequate supply of housing, and political roadblocks. One of those political roadblocks that I would like to discuss today that's relevant to this presentation is the recall of 2 progressive officials, Chris Crone and Drew Glover. So the recalling of elected officials is something that's actually becoming more frequent in the age of Trump, and especially with like some of these toxic internet cultures. So the recall campaign essentially began on Nextdoor. It was fueled largely by landlord backlash to a rent control measure that deeply divided residents and really did define the city council election for that year. So while rent controlled failed that year, in the November 2018 election, 2 progressives were elected, and this boosted the city council's progressive majority 4-3. This was the first time, basically since the financial crisis of 2008, the city council was progressive and oriented towards affordable housing. So an angry landlord class basically took umbrage with Drew Glover's bold support, and he was quickly targeted as a bully, demeaning to women, etc. He's also one of the first 2 Black men from Santa Cruz to be elected to the city council. So this was very significant. He kind of came into the city council as there was already a lot of tension surrounding this kind of battle over Measure M, which was the rent control. So by June 2019, there was already a motion, which less than 6 months after this progressive had now gotten the seat, there was already kind of, the recall was basically already underway. So a citizens initiative was started by this group, Santa Cruz United. And Santa Cruz United is kind of like a coalition of property owners, landlords, residents, basically just, they call themselves a grassroots campaign. So anyway, Nextdoor is a hyper-local social networking service for neighborhoods. Since launching in the US in 2011, Nextdoor is now in use in 180,000 US neighborhoods, including more than 90% of those in the 25 largest cities. This is according to an article in The Atlantic. As a neighborhood social network, Nextdoor aims to bring neighbors together for the greater good of the community. And similar to other apps and platforms oriented around the home, your account is tied to your address and according to your neighborhood. So users can post in their neighborhood forum or share to the general feed, which is supposed to be citywide. And designated categories exist for specific topics of conversation. A 2019 Vox article nicknames Nextdoor, along with apps like Neighbors, which is Amazon's attendant app to the Ring security system, and also the app Citizen, which is a real-time crime tracking app. Vox called these fear-based social media insofar as they fuel a vicious cycle of fear, reinforce or encourage the desire for increased security, and promote, at worst, condone, at best, vigilantism. So the space for conversation seems to largely be focused on the fear of crime, even though Nextdoor claims that only 4% of their posts is really about that. So despite the company really trying to mitigate a lot of the racial profiling that takes place on Nextdoor, they've really struggled to kind of break away from this, and they're pretty explicit about how you should use the platform. So there's this Good Neighbor Pledge, there are these community guidelines, how to describe crime on Nextdoor and how to use Nextdoor for crime prevention. So basically all of content is moderated by a lead. And so if content is flagged as harmful or offensive, leads vote on this, whether or not it violates community guidelines. And then essentially, if it gets enough votes, then it's taken down. But really, it's all very subjective. So it's all very subjective. So I'm particularly interested in Nextdoor because I think that it offers a very distinct view of the relationship and the intersections between the fear of crime via fear-based social media and the real estate state. So I really want to encourage us to think about how the platform is structured and to inform opinion, but also inform policy and how it can be used as a tool to undo democratic process, like a recall. So by real estate state, I'm calling on Sam Stein's coining and use of the term in his book, Capital City. This book is about the frequent contradictions that city planners encounter as cities kind of rebrand or essentially gentrify to become fire cities. So finance, insurance, real estate. City planners ultimately learn that they get caught in the crossfire and basically answer to the shareholders of the city, who are private property owners, real estate developers, growth coalitions, et cetera. So he defines the real estate state as a political formation in which real estate capital has inordinate influence over the shape of our cities, the parameters of our politics, and the lives that we lead. So he goes on to say this is not new, nor is it all encompassing. It's another expression of government. Private property as a commodity is really not new. But what is new is the outsized power of real estate interests within the capitalist state. As real estate values have risen to absurd heights, so has the political force of real estate capital. So here in Santa Cruz, where real estate values have also risen to absurd heights, so too has the political force of real estate capital. And we saw that with the recall, and we also continue to see it in the way that people describe their politics online. And we kind of like, we see this political force really coming out on Nextdoor. In 2017, Nextdoor announced that it would add this real estate section to their platform to compete with Zillow. So I just kind of want to point out right here, you can see this 1,200 square feet, and this house right here is up for sale, almost $1 million. So just to give you an idea of like just how high the cost of living is. And this is, an inherent kind of mechanism of exclusion. And by mechanism of exclusion, what I mean is really just implicit and explicit barriers of access both to the platform and to the community, or in other words, the housing market. So living in a certain neighborhood comes with its own price tag, right? Inherent exclusions there, of course. Having an address is, your account is predicated on having an address. So if you live in Santa Cruz and you're a renter, you're very likely that you're renting in precarious conditions. You're probably not very housing secure. It's very, very rare for a housing insecure person to have an account on Nextdoor. So in other words, these conversations just don't reach them. They can't tap in or access these conversations. There's also some ambiguity around how content is structured on the newsfeed. We see here on this top left post, he basically says, I tried to share citywide, but it looks like that's only going to my nearby neighborhoods, excluding part of the east side. So that's like, again, it's not really that clear how some of the content gets where it does. And then also, again, going back to this idea of content moderation, who moderates fairness? Who gets to decide? The leads have a lot of power, and they also have their own biases. So how can Nextdoor be more democratic? Can it be more democratic? So while users on Nextdoor share a common goal of respectful debate and, broadly speaking, building community hinged on safety and connection, the space for collective imagining and community building becomes a battleground to hash out ideals of belonging. These inevitably amplify racial and class biases and sustain ideals of authoritarianism upon which the suburban surround thrives. So David Banks writes about the authoritarian surround as the American suburb. And he says the modern suburb began as a means of providing abundant, comfortable housing and has now evolved into a carefully tuned media surround replete with ubiquitous screens running alarmist media. He also says suburbs are basically a sorting device, right? So there's, again, like those mechanisms of exclusion. It demonizes outsiders and terrorizes residents with this racialized fear of intruders. And so he says the poor, precisely because they lack the material means of navigating the suburbs, are portrayed as either a threat or an impediment to the middle class well-being. So as Nextdoor supplements these ubiquitous screens with alarmist media, it's also bringing together these exclusionary mechanisms of the real estate state and the exclusionary mechanisms of the authoritarian surround. So now I'm just going to kind of turn our attention to some posts. Again, like I said, they're very long, so please don't get overwhelmed. I just tried to bring out some of the quotes here. She says, I think it's bewildering for our kids to hear everyone freaking out about coronavirus, but also that we should be fine with less police protection and that it should be fine for people to camp anywhere. Conversation always rolls back to city council. I call 911 whenever I see something, but the police aren't allowed to do much. I'm thinking maybe it's time that we flood our city council with some casual, intimate, personal accounts of what it's like. Let them know why our teens have to undergo severe stress year round, not just during the coronavirus. And so again, like this investing tendency to conform with political urgency, if we were to consider the hallmark of the real estate state, meaning having inordinate influence over the shape of our cities and the parameters of our politics, Nextdoor really makes these conditions visible and palpable. So here again is another example. The November election is an important tool to elect moderate, tough on crime candidates. We had a social justice, soft on crime, enabling transient behavior until the recall. Let's take back our beautiful town. So this idea that the recall was a strategy of restoring like the kind of political future, the potential for the political future that these users on Nextdoor imagine. And so beyond the recall, it's also quite frightening to think about how Nextdoor is actually used in policy and to inform, decision-making at a higher level. So here is a resident in Santa Cruz who used to work as the city manager in a nearby town. And he basically is saying how he set up certain things on his Nextdoor account to like track various data. And then he used that data to make decisions as a city manager in a neighboring city. And the police chief of that city was also a neighborhood lead where he lived in San Jose. So he incorporated that data as well. So this is really crazy to say the least, but I would just like to say that the city manager model is very problematic. As a city manager, he's not even elected, he's appointed. And so he can't even be held accountable or recalled in the way a city council member would. And oftentimes it's city council who is to blame in the public eye. So again, this post is especially problematic in a time where defunding the police is a popular conversation. And the message to officials is to really work towards dismantling racist legacies in the criminal justice system, not propping them up. So what does this mean? What is Nextdoor for? Here's a long post from sometime last summer in getting closer to the election. She says, as a lead, we vote on removing replies or posts. But of course, this is after it's been sent to 10,000 people. So that does little good. So again, there's like those kind of inherent ambiguity, not really sure how content is moderated. And then she says, Nextdoor is our only democratic forum. And I want to make sure that it's consistent, right? And then she says, Nextdoor is how the location of petitions for the recall reach the public. So if this is where we get candidates out of office, is it also where we get people in? And she goes on to say, things done to us by governments or corporations are fair game for discussions, but the things that we may be doing to others through government or corporations are generally deemed personal rants. So she's kind of saying, like, how can we talk about these things if we actually just have difference of opinions about where to even begin? And she said, so what would you like leads to do? So because Nextdoor is oriented around housing, the home, and community, understanding how users engage the platform to express and profess their deepest desires of safety and freedom is central to how the political force of real estate capital lives within its subjects. Structural issues are refracted back to us in a patchwork of individual posts and stories. So the content collected today was not really selected by any formal method or rigorous intellectual method, critical method, I should say. But these snapshots do reflect the relationship that the platform engenders between users and how they see their community, how they see their political process, and really the scripts of belonging. So here's the last post that I'm going to share with you today. He says, the recall was clearly a very divisive issue. It'll be interesting to see how less contentious city council fosters like less contentious issues. And then they say, I expect to be agreeing with people I disagreed with and vice versa. This is local politics in the leftmost city in America. So users see Nextdoor as the space for discussion of the future of the city and the tool to organize certain political outcomes. They can co-opt the radical potential of social media movements, as with Believe Women, to pursue a political agenda that is heavily entrenched in the interests of private property. And inevitably, many people who live in this city are excluded from what he is describing as local politics in the leftmost city of America. So I would argue that this is politics in the real estate state. In this supposed leftmost city, the imagined community is one where property values are high, city council favors property owners over the majority rental population, homelessness is invisible, out of sight, and hidden, and teenagers feel safe. The depths of the power of real estate capital exist in emotional and affective attachments to our homes and communities and play off the deepest, most intimate areas of our lived experience. The centrality of home, community, and care in how we construct our identity and move through the world is an essential part of being human. After all, shelter is a basic human need, as is connection and belonging and sociality. Nextdoor highlights these tensions and reveals the political force of real estate capital over the shape of our city, the parameters of our politics, and the lives that we lead. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Kelly. That was very provocative, and look forward to hopefully discussing it with some questions from the Discord. And now we'll move on to Sun Ha, who's going to deliver his presentation.
Hi, everyone. Just give me a second to get the slides up. Here we are. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sun Ha Hong, and I study the uncertainties around technologies of datafication. In other words, the places where promises go unfulfilled, the data gets it wrong, and the people are left to pick up the pieces. And what I'd like to do is outline today one particular pattern that I see around the moralization of predictivity, which really works as a two-way street. On one hand, data-driven prediction is touted as sort of a default lens for every kind of societal problem. So the implicit idea being that anything and everything can be predicted in this quantified way. On the other hand, though, when these technologies can't really come through on these promises, when these technologies sort of crash and burn, it's humans that are asked to meet the technology halfway. So we're the ones being asked to talk and behave in a more machine-readable manner in order to be counted as employable, as legal, as innocent, and so on and so forth. So it is this kind of process at work in how American counter-terrorist surveillance has evolved since September 11. Because what happens after 9/11 is that we have a particular imagination of the terrorist that becomes dominant, this idea of the lone wolf, the idea that terrorism has become more unpredictable than ever, and therefore, it is argued, we need more invasive forms of electronic surveillance in order to defeat this uncertainty. So terrorism becomes characterized as a kind of data problem that apparently we can solve through the kinds of surveillance programs that we would only learn about later, much later, through Edward Snowden. And the argument, again, is that we have no choice but to develop this kind of indiscriminate dragnet surveillance. The argument becomes that we can't just look for the needle in the haystack, but that the NSA has to collect the entire haystack, that they have to collect every kind of data that they can get their hands on. So this is the promise of predictivity as a way to secure the nation. But then when we start to zoom into the kinds of data that are actually collected and have a look at how they're used, we start to see that there is a yawning gap between the promise of prediction and the messiness of actual data. Let me show you one example. This is Sami Osmakach, who was a man who had previously been known to make extremist comments, but there wasn't much more at that point. So there was talk, but no action. But this changes when he is identified as a suspect by the FBI. That's when we see a change in the kind of data he is made to produce. So here you see an FBI undercover agent who brings Sami Osmakach to this hotel. supplies him with the weapons and equipment that you can see on the video. And the agent is coaching him on how to use these weapons because the guy has no clue otherwise. They give him the money to buy these weapons because he cannot afford them on his own. And they would even pay for his taxi so that Osmakach is able to get a ride to the so-called attack spot, where, of course, the FBI is waiting to arrest him. And the agents called this a Hollywood ending internally, because what they've managed to do here is fabricate the kind of data that is necessary to justify preemptive arrest from a legal point of view. And when I say fabricate, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're actively and deliberately creating what they know to be falsehoods, but rather it's pointing to the sense that all forms of data, all forms of prediction rely on this kind of active form of judgment and production. And the upshot of all of this is that nobody is ever going to know if the arrest was truly necessary, because Osmakach was preemptively arrested and charged. That means none of us will know what he might have done or what he might not have done if he had stayed free. So what we see here isn't really a technology-first problem. Rather, it's technology and data being used to reproduce and amplify existing problems that we already have around how we turn bodies into facts and how we make data out of people. Right? It's not something that's necessarily driven or necessitated by advancements in technology. It's the way in which we make use of often imperfect and messy technologies. Consider, for example, this survey, which was used by FBI agents in the mid-2010s as part of their assessment of terrorism suspects. So they were trying to see, they were trying to assess how much of a risk is this person of turning to violence? How drastic action do we need to take to stop them right now? And so this is very much a human process. It's not fully automated or anything, but the principles are quite similar to how courts are using algorithms to predict recidivism in bail decisions right now across America. And the kinds of questions they ask are striking. You can see here, has the subject experienced divorce recently? Have they been victims of assault? Apparently that's a flag. Have they played laser tag? So it's really scraping the barrel in terms of behavioral data. It's not simply that the data is out there. There are decisions and prejudices embedded into how these speculative pieces of information are put together into life-changing decisions. And this is exactly where long-standing human biases creep back into the data. The survey asks about cases like contact with overseas extremists or changing physical appearances, or religious conversion. And you will note that all of those things apply to a potential jihadist, but none of them really applies to a domestic white supremacist. So even though the idea of the lone wolf and all of the surveillance systems constructed for it, even though all of that is theoretically in pursuit of an unknown danger, in practice, this unknown tends to be implicitly filled in with the imagined brown killer in ways that are not necessarily demanded by objective numbers. So the point is that data is always composed of choices about what we try to predict, what we measure as a proxy for what we trust as reliable measurement. And right now, with the pandemic in full swing, we're seeing this. We're seeing a wide array of half-baked algorithms being rushed into people's lives. So, very recently, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen how the British A-levels, their university entrance exams, were cancelled for public health reasons. And then the final scores were predicted using a set of black boxed algorithms. And without going into too much detail as to how that works, the first thing that happened was that about 40% of students saw their scores downgraded relative to teacher assessment. So this is a set of predictive failure or a set of questions around predictive accuracy. But then the predictive failure doesn't hit everybody equally, right? So one of the things the model did was you would partly predict student scores based on how well their schools had done historically. So we were seeing cases of really, really top students who already had provisional offers from Cambridge because they were already doing so well. And then they would get those offers rescinded because of the algorithmic downgrade, right? So it is really telling that when these data-driven predictions get it wrong again and again, they disproportionately hurt the weakest members of society and never really the other way around. To come back to the lone wolf and counterterrorism, though, we see these disparities in our technology, in our data, get reinforced in the realm of culture and language as well. So one telling example was the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, where there was an intense national media ritual that sought to rationalize the event in terms of our existing preconceptions around Islam and terrorism. So on the right, you have this infamous cover by the Rolling Stone, which was heavily criticized for the glam coverage of the younger bomber. But on the left, I think this is much more significant. You see a collection of quotations from the media coverage at the time, where people were talking about how shocked everybody was in that community in Massachusetts. So this idea that, he liked Game of Thrones, he had a scholarship, he wasn't a loner, he was normal, he was not a devout Muslim. So what's notable is the terms by which the bomber is normalized to say, we are so surprised he was just a normal kid. The terms by which this normalization happens reflect the implicit judgment about what a terrorist monster must look like, what normal Americans must look like, and how these two categories must not be allowed to overlap in our imagination. And we really see the same logic at work in the NSA's internal document and in their internal culture as well. This is a training slide deck that the NSA were using to introduce their own data search tool. But notice the fake name that they're using here as an example, Mohammed Bad Guy. Elsewhere, they also use Mohammed Raghead. So again, it's this imagined brown killer that lurks at the heart of the database, a priori any kind of actual data collection. The trouble, of course, is that the majority of violent mass killings in the United States since 9/11 have come at the hands of white supremacists. Even the name the lone wolf, in fact, and this is the final irony here, even the name the lone wolf originates with white supremacists in the 1990s. It's people like Tom Metzger, who's an ex-KKK Grand Wizard, who are coming up with this term. Because for them, the lone wolf was a way to imagine their struggle in heroic, masculine, Wild West terms, right? You're just a lone wolf hunting for your prey. But it ends up becoming this moniker through which a vast national surveillance apparatus envelops the United States over the last 20 years, and an apparatus which has become fixated on the figure of the brown bearded terrorist, which exists but is not necessarily a representative outcome of a purely objective data-driven process. So just to wrap up here, where do we stand today, though? Because this has been building up over the last 10, 20 years. And I want to tell you about a temporal irony. So I was tracing these events around the lone wolf and documenting them in my book, Technologies of Speculation. And the book was released last month. But at the same time that this book was finally coming out, we were also seeing how the same surveillance technologies are being used against protesters that are speaking out against the police killing of George Floyd. And we're going to see exactly the same thing happening throughout Wisconsin and across the country again. Because we have confirmed reports of law enforcement in this country, in America, using tools like social media surveillance and facial recognition to identify and arrest individual protesters. And by the way, please do not post videos that show protesters' faces on social media. So again, we see choices being made about what kinds of bodies are subject to this data and to this surveillance. We see an active choice in which these imperfect and prejudiced kinds of surveillance technologies are first wielded disproportionately against brown people and Muslim people, and now they are also being extended to particular kinds of protesters against the regime. So in the book, I talk about this as a form of control creep, because we can never make the mistake of thinking that data collected in one context isn't going to be used for other purposes. In fact, the available data, the available technology is going to inspire and encourage these other kinds of abuses. So I just want to end here by reiterating that when we turn data-driven prediction into a moral injunction, when we develop this broader imagination that we can use data to predict anything, and therefore we should, this way of thinking doesn't stay inside databases, right? They become enmeshed with how we think about crime, about race, about being American. And we cannot allow the mythology of objective prediction and perfect technology to gaslight us from the problems associated with these imaginaries. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Sunha, thank you so much for that presentation. And I'd just like to welcome back Keli for our little Q&A session. We have some questions coming up in the Discord. So we'll give folks a moment to sort of process Sunha's presentation and maybe post some questions in there. In the meanwhile, I have a question that I hope speaks to both of your work, although there are certainly some differences that we might have to navigate here. But one of you is an activist and the other is an educator. So I'm curious about the role of sort of the people or non-experts in critiquing or resisting the application of particular technologies, as well as in the determination of desirable technological futures. I think here of the work of broad coalitions of groups working to ban facial recognition in Detroit, near where I live, and elsewhere. In a sense, I guess I'm asking where the rubber meets the road, where the intersections of theory and lived experience, both of students and community members, can generate potentially transformative demands and alliances. Are there any experiences from your own work that come to mind?
Yeah, so I guess thinking about, so your question is, where does the rubber meet the road in terms of like using social media or using technology for the kind of the greater good or like to achieve certain things. But then where does the line get drawn in terms of like what's harmful and what's beneficial, or is that kind of?
Sure, or have you seen the production of maybe an alternative, or are people proposing sort of, alternatives? Where do we, where can sort of folks demand something else if they're able to?
Yeah. Well, I'm just reminded of some content that I found as I was going through Nextdoor, in recent weeks when I was making this presentation. And someone basically says like, I would never, he says like, I would never report another person for what they said because it's freedom of speech. And then someone responds and says, that's great and all, but Nextdoor, this is Nextdoor's business. This is their website and they can decide what their rules are. So if you don't like it, we have to make our own websites, basically. And so that kind of opened up a debate about who and why should something get reported. And yeah, I guess like in terms of the venues that we could demand better tools of organizing, I think that's really the struggle that we're all kind of plagued with as we're really tethered to these platforms, but don't really see the full potential kind of coming out from their use.
Cool. And just briefly to jump on that, one of the examples is I think the U-turn on the A levels in the UK is hugely encouraging. So I talked about it, but of course the end of that story for now is that after several days of massive uprisings, the government did a U-turn, and we had students on the street yelling, "Fuck the algorithm." They weren't yelling, "Update your algorithm." They weren't yelling, "Make sure you assign a diversity committee on your algorithm," or "Give us better settings on the dashboard." They were saying, "Fuck off." Which I think is the right message in this case. But make no mistake, such efforts will return, and it will return in the US and Canada and the UK and elsewhere. So I think we're reaching a point where this is at all of our doorsteps now. This is in our homes collecting our conversations. This is in our job applications, filtering out our CVs before any human gets to reject them. And I think one of the things for all of us is we should all think twice before handing over our student or our client or our delivery persons or our neighbors over to algorithmic judgment, which is what happens when we report people, when we talk about them on Nextdoor, when we score them on Uber, when we install online proctoring systems for students. So many of us in our ordinary daily lives now are in a position where we can just speed a little friction on that road and just say, let's slow down a little bit and let's make it a little harder for these kinds of scores to dominate people's lives.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Just picking up where that left off, I just got a question from the Discord, or possibly just from the folks at Theorizing the Web, but it's a question for both of you, so we'll just keep going in that direction. There's two questions, and both of them are sort of similar, but I'm going to pose them both depending on which wording sort of appeals to you. What is the role of Nextdoor and similar platforms in this kind of data collection, aka racist surveillance driven into false objective data collection regimes? Or we might say, how do things like Nextdoor create public support for predictive policing? I think those are maybe two sides of a similar coin, but I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's actually really what my bigger research interests are all about, is how are these fear-based social media kind of like just facilitating and normalizing really increased surveillance and increased levels of policing, really. And I think that, you know, there are some other posts that I found that I did not add to this presentation that are describing the police chief and how we should Santa Cruz should recall Andy Mills, our police chief. This comes at a moment when, you know, in the Black Lives Matter uprisings, our police chief knelt next to our Black mayor, and then our Black mayor turned around and actually said that, you know, we want to reform the police. So there's a lot of like tensions really about how we're going to move past these kind of echo chambers, right? Because a lot of times, even in our city council meetings, a lot of activists will call into the city council meetings and will flood the lines with what they want. But then city council says, well, there's a whole group of people in our town that aren't really being represented here. And then you go on Nextdoor and that's where those people really are. So it's really a matter of like, where are the proper venues, you know, to kind of hash out the virtues or the values of these technologies.
I mean, Kelly knows more about this than I do. Just adding a little small part on there, I would say that the company's interest is really key here, because a lot of these companies have inherent economic incentive for working more closely with the police. They have an incentive for building a community of people who want the cops in their neighborhood, or who want the cops to be more involved and get more of this data. And this is why, as we know, Amazon Ring aggressively reaches out to police departments around the country and offers the use of their technologies. We see something similar with Flock, which has been around for about 5 years. And there's a pattern. These companies start off. Flock says, we just monitor the street outside your house for suspicious cars and stuff like that. So this is for you. But over time, now they've pivoted to saying, also, we're going to supply all of that data to the police. So they start treating the police as a client. And this is really a pattern, not just in these cameras, but in smart machines generally, right? Fitbit starts off saying you should do more exercise and track yourself. Over time, they start doing deals with insurance companies because they want access to your data, right? And now Google is buying Fitbit, or trying to buy Fitbit, subject to regulatory approval. You're going to see that data and those economic incentives enter into an even larger network. So it's never about just the primary purpose that you see on the advertising flyer. It's those economic incentives that are driving them to these kinds of things.
Terrific. I have a not fully formed question yet, but I am curious. So, and then we'll jump to one from the Discord. So one of the things I'm reminded of in this conversation is the difference between like the idea of biopolitics and the idea of necropolitics, and the question of like, does the state encourage us, or the state sort of capital industrial complex encourage us to live and become productive members of society and control us through that? Or do they have control over basically who dies, right? That sort of the necropolitics is being the flip of biopolitics. And I'm also reminded of the idea of Althusser saying that you become a subject when the police says, "Hey, you." And it seems there are two very different kinds of subjectification happening here. There's the property dwelling, property owning subject of Nextdoor, and then there's the subject of these algorithmic systems of prediction, control, and surveillance that I think have more to deal with like who dies than maybe who engages in sort of the productive behavior within quote unquote society. Are there places where those kind of subjects intersect, or are there places where those of us who might be more on Nextdoor or in the communities of Nextdoor might become an ally to those who are excluded and maybe more subject to the systems of prediction and control of the police state?
So, I mean, maybe only obliquely coming into your question, but when I hear about that, what I'm often thinking of is Foucault at one point in Discipline and Punish writes about margins of tolerated illegality. And what he meant by that is that in any social order, there are often pockets of not well-governed, informal, or even directly illegal areas that everybody knows about. But it is tolerated because it fulfills an essential function, right? So it's like the black market selling food in North Korea during the famines in the 1990s, where the North Korean government allows it to grow because the state cannot supply the food in a regular basis. And then they clamp down on it again later when the food supply improves. But you can think about it in a lot of other ways, right? You can think about it in terms of the teachers who don't mark you down as late, even though you were 2 minutes late, because they're human and they're trying to have a human relationship with you, right? The fact that you are going to run yellow lights sometimes, and we don't have a guillotine coming down from the sky snapping your car in half for that every single time, right? So they're always supposed to be these pockets and buffers of space where you don't get instantly punished for every single infraction, micro infraction that you make. And one of the things that's happening with these systems is maybe that for certain kinds of people, those gaps get closed down a lot more. And so it is a question of how stringent you choose to get on certain kinds of people over others and say, we're going to watch you. And even though you've done nothing wrong, you happen to walk past this neighborhood in which it turns out you do not belong. We are now going to document you and film you and talk about you and pass that data on to police. That really squishes out these tolerated margins. And it leads to a society in which you can never do anything wrong, but also you can never be mistaken as doing anything wrong, because then you're fucked. And that is something that is eventually going to make everybody suffer, not just people on the margins. But the people on the margins suffer first. And it's our choice as to whether we ignore that or we recognize what's happening on that.
Amazing. Keli, do you have?
Yeah, so I'm also thinking about Neighborhood Watch, actually. I'm thinking of like the gaps in these, we were talking about the gaps in the technology and the process or in the policing. And so Neighborhood Watch is really a great example of how the community is actually responsibilized to kind of step up and do that work of gatekeeping or of surveilling. And so, yeah, so I'm kind of, you know, the whole idea of home security really comes back to who is able to move through these spaces and what kind of threats do they pose as they, you know, come into contact with like my safe fortress, and what threats do they pose? Why are they here? You know, so I'm really interested in thinking about, you know, things like Neighborhood Watch, which were, you know, kind of came out in a moment of Cold War anxiety surrounding like, you know, who you were living among in your community, right? So Neighborhood Watch really kind of came to rise in this moment, and now we're seeing that it's online. And so I think that these are really important points, and I appreciate the question.
Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna just grab one from the Discord channel here. Q&A for Nextdoor. Okay, Kelly, here you go. What is Nextdoor for is an elegant and important question. I was wondering if you've heard any indication from Nextdoor, I think they're probably meaning sort of Nextdoor corporate, that they see recalls as a good use of their platform, or are they concerned about it?
Well, Nextdoor just wants to be hyper local. So they want to be advertising local businesses. And as Sunha said, it's really for them, it's all about the bottom line. And so I think for Nextdoor, it's not, a problem how the platform is. It's not necessarily, the ends justify the means, I think. So as long as people continue to use the platform, if people are, let's say, frustrated by the racial profiling on Nextdoor, Nextdoor is going to come out with algorithms that kind of encourage people to get back on and see if it works. So really, Nextdoor is not actually that invested, as Sunha said, they're not really that invested in what the conversations are or how those conversations are really driving IRL politics. Like, they're not really that concerned about that. They're just happy that people are using the platform. So, so I think that, when it comes to like Nextdoor, like who's in charge, it's like they place leads in charge. They're kind of like, we're just gonna leave it up to you guys. Freedom of speech, do your thing. This is local politics, right? So yeah.
It's interesting. It feels similar to sort of what Sunha was talking about with the sort of application of databases or data sets or algorithmic inference and recommendation systems from one domain to another. And I suppose, and Sunha, you feel free to elaborate on this, I suppose that, like companies like IBM or Palantir or something, they're incentivizing organizations to do that because it's profitable for them.
Yeah, and again, it's this kind of imagination that if the technology is out there, then we have to make use of it. And if the predictivity is possible, then we have to do it. And of course, what gets occluded is that a lot of these predictive systems fail a lot. A lot of these systems disappoint a lot. And when we usually talk about what Google can do and what Facebook can do, we're usually talking about what they say they can do and what they hope they can do when the data is perfect and they've upgraded the systems. So there's always this kind of carrot in front of a horse kind of deal where they say, just give us a few more months, Facebook says, to fix our mistakes and learn from our mistakes. Once Mark Zuckerberg grows as a person more and has more life experiences, because that's what he's all about, we are going to get it right, and we're truly going to be able to connect you without all of the problems. That's never going to happen, Mark. You're 30-something now, or whatever you are. It's never going to happen. Facebook is going to continue to facilitate hate because it's come too far down that road. It's never going to become this perfect social network. And that's sort of the attitude we should also take towards every other piece of predictive technology we see now. When somebody says you can use AI to predict if students are cheating, that's bullshit. And maybe they'll get there in the future. Maybe they'll get better at doing that. But in the meantime, a lot of people are going to get hurt. And that is really usually the primary consequence of these predictive systems when they are deployed in such an indiscriminate manner.
I would also like to just point
Kelly, go for it.
Sorry, I would just like to say that Predpol is based in Santa Cruz. And so this is actually something that's like a really serious issue in the community right now in the conversation about defunding the police, or how what the city budget is really going towards and what the police are really doing. And so Predpol has really been tested out a lot in Santa Cruz, specifically on, the vulnerable communities and vulnerable populations.
Awesome. Okay. So we just want to thank everybody for coming out today. Thanks to those of you on the Discord for the Q&A. Thanks to everybody at MoMI and Theorizing the Web for facilitating this. And of course, thanks to Sunha and Kelly for killing it. You guys were amazing. And super quick, I just have a few notes. Go buy Sunha's book, support the work that Kelly's doing. And the next episode of Theorizing the Web Presents will be called Bad Company. And it will be streamed live on September 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern and 11 a.m. Pacific. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.